Hey, you are listening to Local Love with Laura, and I have a very special guest with me today, a good friend of mine and also an occupational therapist, Harriet Muse. And we're going to talk about something really fun, the inner critic. Thank you for joining me, Harriet.
Thanks for having me, Laura.
I'm so excited. It's always nice to have friends, especially in lockdown when you're like separated. It's a good excuse to make you hang out with me virtually.
Yep, that's the only reason I'm doing it as well, so I can hang out with you for the next hour.
Yay. But yeah, I thought it would be good to get someone like you who is an occupational therapist to sort of talk about like the well-being side to social media and that little bit of like self-care, especially when so many of us who are, I guess, hopefully listening to my podcast are freelancers and music artists sort of putting themselves out there, and there can be all that self-doubt and everything. It's always good to get some tips on how to keep a little sane and not judge yourself so hard.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can all benefit from that.
Yeah. So can you tell me a little bit about your background?
Yeah, like you said, I'm an occupational therapist and I work in the mental health sector. So, work at an inpatient psychiatric hospital running group therapy and doing some individual therapy as well. And then I also work at a therapeutic horticulture center where
Ooh.
we do therapy in the garden, which is something different and kind of cool.
Yeah, that's my kind of therapy. A little bit of gardening, a little bit of, you know, talking about your feels.
Absolutely. It's just the best. Yeah. Being out in nature is just, there's nothing better, I don't think, for your mental health.
Yeah. And so what I guess is sort of the difference between like an occupational therapist and maybe like a psychologist?
Such a good question. And occupational therapist's most feared question.
Sorry.
Because while we've been around for a long time, we OTs tend to have a bit of a crisis of identity sometimes, I guess you could call it. We are sometimes a bit of a jack of all trades because we work across so many different sectors, doing so many different things. So you'll meet OTs that work in physical health with like stroke rehabilitation, or people working in hand therapy or with children. But I guess in my realm, as an OT in mental health, our main emphasis is around helping people with putting things into action. So if you sort of think of psychologists as kind of focusing on that talk-based therapy, OTs will often be the person working with somebody around, okay, how do you actually implement the changes that you need to make in your life in order to live like a meaningful and satisfying life?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That
Is
totally
it?
makes sense. And I feel like I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I feel like as someone who I feel like in the last few years I've put more effort into understanding, mental health myself, but it can be a bit like a little bit confusing, I guess, with like what the different areas of like psychologists, psychiatrists, occupational therapists. So I thought it'd be good to just get a little bit of understanding for anyone who's listening.
Oh, definitely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so, like, our topic today is the inner critic. Can you tell us a little bit about what the inner critic is?
For sure. Yeah. And I'm guessing that this is going to sound pretty familiar to most of your listeners once we start talking about what it is. So essentially, the inner critic is that negative little voice inside our head. So it's a voice that judges us, criticizes us, attacks us. It's often quite punitive and demanding and tells us things such as we're not good enough, or we should or must have done something a certain way, or we must work harder or achieve more, or sometimes telling us that, we're a bit of a loser or we're lazy, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure, like, yeah, it's something that I hear a lot in my own head. I think as I think especially as like someone who does try to do more, like puts myself out there through work, such as like running a podcast or, even freelancing or, designing content in where I work and stuff like that. There's all these areas where you put yourself out there, and it definitely opens up for that little voice being like, you're not good enough, no one likes what you're doing. And I think being in social media or being active on a social media platform, it's so easy to get stuck in the likes and the unfollows. And then that, I feel like that feeds your inner critic to be like, well, you're definitely not good enough because 50 people just unfollowed you, loser.
Absolutely it does. Yeah. I mean, it's that niggling kind of self-doubt, isn't it? And the worst thing about the inner critic is that it's always looking for evidence to support it. So like you were saying, it might be that you lost 50 followers, and you'll be completely fixated on that without potentially attending to all the followers that you've gained in the same amount of time, or all of the engagement that you've gotten from your followers. Our inner critic is so powerful that we tend to really focus on that negative voice much more so than we do our positive voice or our accomplishments or successes.
Yeah. And do you think it's like something we're sort of born with or conditioned with? Like, is it impacted by the way we grow up?
Absolutely. So I think it's fairly safe to say that babies are not born with an inner critic, right?
Yeah.
But rather, we develop this voice through our experiences in our early life.
Yeah.
And often, when we talk about the inner critic's voice, that will often originate as somebody else's voice in your life. So it might be that it was somebody in your family, like a primary caregiver, such as your mother or your father. It might have been through your schooling, through classmates or teachers, or through sort of the voices of your culture and society, that feed you these sort of messages about yourself and your place in this world that are often quite defeating and negative and judgmental.
So would you say that, like, because obviously with what you've sort of spoken about, the inner critic sounds like a pretty dark and not so nice thing, but do you think that it has a purpose in life?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, to be fair, I probably have spoken about it really negatively. And sometimes these messages that we receive might not have necessarily been meant maliciously, right? I'm trying to think of a good example of that. So, for example, you might have been raised in a family where it's just part of that family structure where a lot of emphasis and focus is put on achieving highly, say academically. So you might have just received consistent messages early in life that it is very important that you achieve high grades. And through that, you start to learn that, okay, if I don't do that, then does that mean there's something wrong with me, right? Or does it mean that I'm defective or a failure in some way? And it's through those messages that can be quite explicit and overt, or can be much more subtle, that are filtered down and then really form our belief system. And I guess to answer your question about whether they serve a purpose, if you think about being a child, say in that family dynamic, it can be really adaptive or protective to take on those messages, can't it? Because you'll start to learn that, okay, you know, it's really important that I hold myself to this very high standard all of the time, or I'm at risk of not getting the approval or the love or the attention that I need from my parents. So I'm actually going to internalize that voice and take it on as truth in order to survive the environment that I'm in. Yeah. I can actually think of another example as well. I don't know whether you can relate to this, but certainly growing up, um, my parents' generation was definitely of this belief that emotions should not be expressed, right? And vulnerability should be hidden. So I was internalizing these messages from a young age that it's not really okay to be really sad or to be really sensitive, or to show a lot of vulnerability. So I started to internalize that message that if I were to express that emotion, that there might be something wrong with me, or that my family might judge me or not accept me as much as I need them to.
Yeah. So I guess in saying that, so it sort of like protects you from your environment or the criticism that people may give you, but then does it stop you? I guess it would then sort of stop you also potentially putting yourself out there. So how do you like push through that?
Yeah. So I guess another purpose that we often think that the inner critic serves is that we think that it's really motivating and that it keeps us in check, right? That I've got to be hard on myself. I've got to hold myself to such unrelenting high standards, or else I will be lazy or
Yeah.
I won't achieve. But unfortunately, the reality often is the opposite of that, that we are so afraid of failure. We are so afraid of doing anything that might elicit that inner critic voice that we actually often start to avoid putting ourselves out there, because it's a lot safer to not try and not fail than to try and fail.
Yeah. So would you have any techniques for us like to I guess listen to that inner critic but push through it and not be scared of putting yourself out there?
Yeah, for sure. I think that, that acknowledgement that the inner critic is a voice that has been with us for a very long time. And it's probably really unrealistic to think, well, we can just turn it off or we can just stop listening to it. Rather, it's more about in the beginning becoming more familiar with that voice. So even using the language that we're using tonight of calling it, labeling it the inner critic, right? That creates a little bit of separation between the inner critic and who we actually are.
Yeah.
Because the truth is that while our inner critic feels automatic and it feels justified and it feels real and true, it isn't often based in reality, is it? And it puts us down much more than is deserving.
I feel like in saying that a good something that I've been thinking about a bit more with my social media, because I feel like especially when I started Local Love, I've been really harsh on myself, probably my little inner critic being like, all these dumb things like, you're too old for this. What are you doing? Like, why are you starting a whole new thing? And even like, I decided to start doing like an Instagram live on the weekend. And like, people would be like, oh, why are you scared of doing it live? But I don't know. It's so much scarier when you do something live. But then I just sort of, instead of getting in my head of being like, you're not going to be pretty enough on your Instagram live, or, no one's going to tune into it and all this stuff, I really thought about, why am I doing this? And for me, the whole point of me doing the Instagram live was, one, I need to practice what I preach. And two, also just practicing that, like actually doing something live and making sure that I'm checking what is happening in the world of social media, because that's what I talk about on my live. So it's like, okay, well, this inner critic is here judging me for these things, but my purpose is actually these things. So they don't align. So why am I really that concerned about that stuff?
Absolutely. I think that you've hit the nail on the head in so many ways. I think that a really you sort of spoke to two things that are really important. The first is always coming back to your why, your purpose. Why is it important to do the scary thing, to do the thing that the inner critic is telling you not to do? Because it is uncomfortable and you're not sure whether you'll be successful or not. But if you can always come back to those values of why that is important for your identity and who you are, I think that that is a really good way to push past the inner critic. And the other thing that you said was about continuing to put yourself out there despite the inner critic. And the thing is about the inner critic is, like I said before, it's always searching for evidence that it's right, you know? So it's always searching for evidence that you are a loser or that you are a failure or that you're not good enough. And if you go into avoidance or giving up, then you're feeding the inner critic. You're proving it right, aren't you? Whereas the more that you put yourself out there, you expose yourself to the scary things, it actually starts to lose its power, because even if the worst case scenario does happen, often it's not really as bad as the inner critic is trying to convince you that it is it?
Exactly. It's like with anything, like, you know, falling in love in a relationship and it ending, or like getting some bad feedback, like really bad feedback on an assignment, or making a mistake at work, which I mean, I've done plenty of those. And like in that moment, you may feel like the world is going to end and you just feel so stressed and anxious and whatnot. But like as time goes on, you do move on from it, and then you forget about it and you pick yourself up and then you put yourself back out there. But I feel like you said, like if you never put yourself out there, then you're always going to be scared to do those things. And so I was going to say, I think like as like a lot of music artists and free anyone who puts themselves out there to be like a freelancer or be their own boss and stuff like that, you're not really going to be the type of people to hide or not put yourself out there. So I think it's like, yeah, it's definitely this beast you have to tame, this little inner critic.
Yeah, absolutely. Because think of all that you would be sacrificing if you decided it's too hard and I'm not going to put myself out there. I mean, in terms of your sense of identity and what's important to you, you'd be sacrificing so much more than if you did the hard thing and the scary thing. And as you said, you know, we do recover. And every time something like this happens, it's good to remind ourselves, you know, am I going to care in 5 years about this mistake that I made or this venture that wasn't successful? And chances are that you're probably going to, I know this sounds really cliche, but you're probably going to regret the things that you didn't do more than the things that you did. And as we know, we learn from these mistakes and these failures. So I think it's really powerful to try and push past that inner critic.
Yeah, and I like how you said like we learn from those things. And I think that's totally true. Like we can get so stuck in this idea of either failure or not doing well, or when we get like when we do fail at something, get so stuck on those negative emotions that we can't at the time really look at like, okay, well actually what did I learn from this? And in my own work, I've been trying to do that more. It might even just be the fact that maybe I made a typo and like an email went out with like a bad typo or something like that. And it's always about checking in with myself and being like, okay, well, what processes can I put in place to make sure that maybe that doesn't happen again? Or is there something going on that's causing this result in my life or something like that? So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
How are we ever going to be good at anything or be successful at anything if we don't practice it? I mean, especially with music, it's not like we were born being able to play Beethoven. You have to do the hard yards and you have to practice that. And making mistakes and failing is such an important part of that. And I think that the more that we do that, the more that we realize as well that this isn't an essential part of our identity or personality, is it? That a mistake is not a definition of self, that because you've made a mistake, you are therefore a failure. Whereas if we start to kind of retreat or withdraw or not put ourselves out there, then we don't actually have enough evidence of the times where we have been successful or where our work has been appreciated or we have done well, because we're not actually doing it.
Exactly. And so many times I mean, there's always going to be grammar Nazis who always correct your typos and things like that. But like, to speak on music, like one of my first shows, like I played in Brisbane, like my band, we went to Brisbane and we played, and I was still really new to playing live. And I put like the cable around the wrong way into my synth. So it was like an L-shaped cable. Anyway, I kicked the DI, which is the box, on the floor, and the cable fell out. And the sound tech was really young, and like I didn't really know what I was doing, and so he just completely muted my synth. So I was like freaking out because I couldn't hear it, and but everyone else was like, no, we can hear the bass, it's totally fine. And so then I just like mimed, like I pressed the buttons like I was playing, but I knew there was no sound coming out, and no one even realized. But I think in saying that, like, I've been playing music for so long that I've made so many silly mistakes. Like I went on stage as like a classical pianist and my music was upside down and I had to flip it partway through the song, and all these little things that then, like, my inner critic has been like, why did you do that? You stuffed that up. But it's actually made me able to cope with larger negative things that have happened, like larger, I guess you would say, failures, and being able to be like, actually, that's not that bad. No one even noticed.
For sure. Yeah. It's actually quite resilience building, isn't it? And I guess also remembering that we are our own harshest critic. The way that we speak to ourselves, we would never dream of speaking to someone else like that. And the fact is that, yeah, nobody is probably judging us as harshly or as critically as we're judging ourselves, right?
Exactly. And I think that's actually like something really good to be mindful of, especially if you're like looking at somebody else's work, or like if you're playing a gig with someone and they come off stage really upset because they think that they've played poorly, is like understanding that it might be really bad for them, but maybe you can say some comforting words or like some positivity to them, because
For
yeah,
sure.
you can be so
And then
judgy to yourself.
And then of course, the trick and the hard part is remembering that compassion that you showed to someone else and starting to see whether you can apply that to yourself,
Oh, that's
which is the hardest thing in the whole world.
yeah.
But that's self compassion.
I remember I listened to a podcast. It's like Mindset and Mentor, I think it is. It's like about your mindset and changing your mindset and everything. And this guy was saying that he would have a picture of himself as a child, and whenever he was getting mad like at himself, he would look at the picture and be like, would you say this to like your child self? And instead he would try and turn it into like, I think there's constructive criticism, so trying to twist it around to be more constructive than just criticism.
But there's a big difference, isn't there, between that constructive criticism, which is balanced and it's based in reality, and it's flexible, versus this inner critic, which is completely black and white. It's either you're a complete failure or a complete success. There's actually not much room often to look at the grays and to think about, okay, yeah, this I could have done better, but this I actually did really well at.
Yeah.
I think it's more important than ever that we find ways to feel connected to one another. And I do truly believe that vulnerability breeds connection.
Yeah.
How people bond through sharing those uncomfortable emotions, sharing the messier parts of their lives that are so relatable to all of us, right? We're all just trying to do our best and fucking it up a lot of the time, right?
Exactly. Well, maybe we can all like have a little challenge, I suppose, of one, being a bit more vulnerable on our social media, and two, making a conscious effort to tell someone that they're doing an amazing job, or like, maybe they're putting out their music, or they've posted a story talking about a matter that means something to them. Maybe you can just like send them a message saying that you appreciated it, or that you think they're doing a really good job.
I think that's such a great idea because I've often wondered about, where does this really harsh criticism come from on social media from other people? And why do people feel the need to really put that hate or that negativity out there in response to somebody who, like I said, is probably just trying to do their best. And I would suggest that says more about them than it does about you, that it's probably them reacting to their own inner critic and their own insecurities, which are piping up saying, hey, this person is succeeding and it's making me feel lesser than or not good enough. And so I need to attack that person to make myself feel soothed or better about myself.
Yeah. So, as a music artist and creative, or even someone who is going like out on a limb to start their own business venture or something, how can you quieten that critic so you can still be vulnerable and put yourself out there?
Yeah, such a good question.
Well, thank you.
And yeah, and there's lots of different strategies that you can maybe try to start to work with this inner critic. And I think I mentioned it before, but the first step is often around identifying your inner critic, and so bringing that sort of curious mind and examining, okay, so where is this coming from? How did my inner critic develop? Were there people in my life that fed me these messages that have led to this belief that, I am inherently not good enough, or I'm a failure, or I'm lazy, or I'm a loser? And from that point, once we start to actually lean into it and explore it, then we might start to be able to break it down a little bit, right? And challenge whether that inner critic is true anymore, or was ever true. So I guess the second part of that is, when that comes up, not only labeling, oh hey, okay, I'm noticing that my inner critic is speaking up, it's getting loud. What is a more balanced perspective that I could take in this situation? What are the facts? And what would maybe a close friend or a family member say to me about this situation that might be quite different from what my inner critic is screaming at me in this moment?
Okay, so what about if you're already starting to spiral and you're doubting yourself and that little voice is just telling you that you're not good enough? How do you sort of get out of that while still feeling okay?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think first and foremost, maybe setting some boundaries around your social media use might be a good start. So knowing when it is time to disconnect,
Yeah.
right? Turn off your devices, turn off your notifications, stop the comparison, stop looking for that evidence to support your inner critic. And once you've done that, I would say that a really good strategy could be, when you start to really notice yourself spiraling, bringing in a circuit breaker, so to speak. Another term for this is called grounding. So this is any practice that helps you to kind of move away from your thoughts, from that rumination, those voices in your head, and come back to the present moment, to the here and now. And so often it's about moving from our internal experience to something external to us, right? So that can look a lot of different ways for a lot of different people, but it could be about going for a walk in nature and really tuning in to your senses, right? So rather than just focusing on your thoughts and the inner critic, actually becoming really aware and observing your environment around you, the sights, the smells, the tastes, the sounds, things like that. Other things that we can do to circuit break are taking a few deep breaths, right?
Yeah.
I know that everybody says that all the time, and we're like, yeah, yeah, we know. But that can actually really help us to just ground into the present moment. Because when we're in our heads, we're not really often in the here and now, are we? We're either worrying about some future event that hasn't happened yet, that we don't have control over, or we're obsessing about something that's happened in the past that we also don't have control over.
And I think, yeah, I think if we can try do those things, like all the techniques that you're saying, and like put it really into perspective, like, is it really that upsetting if something's not done? Or, you know, I think I have like students as well through teaching and whatnot, and the pressure that they put on themselves. And it's okay to speak to your teachers or, you know, your employer and be like, look, I'm actually finding it hard to complete this task. It's not to the level I want. Can I please have some more time? And it might be it feels stressful before you've asked for that, but as soon as you ask, most of the time people are going to be like, yeah, that's fine. Do you want an extra 3 days? You know, and that relieves a big bit of pressure.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you know, there's a good chance that this might bring up the inner critic for some people, though, this idea of actually setting some boundaries and taking breaks and stepping away, because we put so much pressure on ourselves. But the truth is that often by taking that step back and getting that perspective, our work is going to end up being a lot better at the end of the day. So it's really worth it to sort of put it in a box, put it on the shelf, and go and do something else so that you can clear your brain, come back to a more sort of settled, calm state of mind before you try and tackle whatever it is that you're trying to achieve.
So can you take us through maybe your routine of how you quieten your mind?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that mindfulness, I know that everybody talks about mindfulness,
And there's
but
probably a good reason for it.
there probably is a good reason for it. Yeah. So I think that having a regular mindfulness practice is one of the most valuable things that you can do, and something that I'm trying to do every morning, pretty much as soon as I wake up. And I choose to do guided meditations, and there's so many resources out there, from like Sam Harris's Waking Up app, or I've just discovered a new guy named Muji, who's just delightful, has like the best voice, so soothing. Or there's Deepak Chopra. So there's just so many free resources out there if that's what people are looking for.
I'll put some links in the podcast so everyone can find those, because they might be very helpful.
Yeah. And, you know, for some people, that sort of structured, guided, seated meditation might work really well. For other people, that might seem way too much and overwhelming. So it might be about practicing mindfulness through different activities or movement, even just practicing for a minute or two, like coming back to your morning routine of not checking your phone. Can you be 100% mindful of your experience as you brush your teeth, just for those 2 minutes? And then you can tell yourself, all right, after those 2 minutes, I'm going to take that box of worries and to-dos and, you know, expectations off of that shelf, and I can open it and I can really dig in. But just for 2 minutes, I'm going to let that go. Yeah. And I'm just going to focus on my breathing, or on brushing my teeth, or on listening to this meditation. Yeah. So that's probably, that's one thing that I try and do every day. Another thing that I find really helpful is journaling. So kind of just getting those thoughts out on paper, and in that way sort of deciding to release them a little bit, rather than just letting them go on repeat around and around and around in your head. Just scribble it out, get it out, and then close the journal and put it in that box, right? And put it on the shelf, the metaphorical box. The other thing that I think is really important is just keeping your resilience up. So making sure that you are eating and sleeping and moving well every day, so that you're actually feeling stronger and more able to handle some of these negative voices or these feelings of self-doubt. Because what we know is that when we're really stressed, or when we're really tired, or when we're not exercising, those voices get a lot louder, don't they?
Yeah.
So being really, really kind to yourself, but also trying to make sure that you are attending to your health, I think is really important.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And there's certainly a lot of resources around developing like a self-compassion mindfulness practice as well. If that's something you're interested in, there's a woman named Kristen Neff who is sort of like I don't know, the grandmother of self-compassion practice. And she's really helpful. And then you've probably heard of Brene Brown, but she speaks a lot to what we were talking about at the start of our conversation around the value of vulnerability, and kind of how connecting that is as a human to be able to sort of be vulnerable and show that to other people as well.
Yeah, well, maybe what we'll do is, we'll put a few links about those people and the apps and stuff that you've mentioned so people can go and have a look themselves. And if anyone has any questions about it, you can just drop me a DM and I can talk to Harriet. And we're trying to do some of these chats a little more regularly because I think as not just music artists and freelancers, but anyone who is on social media opens themselves up to some of these topics that are quite hard or you feel like are quite hard to deal with, or you may not realize that it's actually a normal thing. And so we'll talk about some of those things, like the imposter syndrome, I think is a really good one to chat about. And yeah, if anyone has a topic that they want us to cover, just let me know. But yeah, it's been great to chat with you, Harriet.
Yeah, you too. Thanks so much for having me.
That's all right. And hopefully I'll catch you in real life real soon.
Yep.
But yeah, thanks everybody. You've been listening to Local Love with Laura, and I'll catch you very, very soon. See ya.